The Nexus Station floated in the void like a metallic flower blooming in the darkness. Its 47 interconnected petals, each representing a different species' contribution to what the diplomatic corps generously called interstellar harmony. Of course, harmony was a relative term when you considered that most of these species would cheerfully incinerate each other's homeworlds given half an excuse and a decent insurance policy. But money, as it turned out, was a universal translator that made even the most bloodthirsty warlords sit down for tea and trade negotiations. The station processed roughly 17 trillion credits worth of commerce daily, which explained why everyone was willing to pretend they enjoyed each other's company for 8-hour shifts before retreating to their species-specific quarters to complain about the smell. The hierarchy on Nexus was brutally simple, and based on what the galactic community considered the most important metric of civilization: who could bench press a small moon. At the top sat the Cracknery, 7-foot-tall slabs of scaled muscle who could crack starship hulls with their bare hands and never let anyone forget it. Below them, the Thorak with their forearms and enthusiasm for demonstrating their grip strength on whatever happened to be nearby. Then came a dozen other species, each finding their place in the pecking order through various displays of physical prowess that would have made a bodybuilding competition look like a knitting circle. And at the bottom, viewed with the kind of fond condescension usually reserved for particularly clever house pets, sat humanity. The humans were adorable, really. They tried so hard with their little tools and their clever engineering solutions, compensating for their obvious physical deficiencies with an almost touching determination. The other species found it endearing, like watching a kitten attempt to hunt a lion. Sure, they could build impressive machines and had a knack for solving problems, but when it came to real work, the kind that required actual strength, well, bless their tiny hearts, they did their best. Zara Blackwood embodied everything the galaxy expected from a human. At 5'6" and possessing what could charitably be called an average build, she moved through the station's corridors with the unremarkable efficiency of someone who had learned not to draw attention to herself. Her standard-issue maintenance coveralls hung loose on her frame, and she carried her toolkit with the practiced economy of movement that came from years of making repairs in spaces designed for beings twice her size. The other species barely noticed her existence, which was exactly how she preferred it. She had work to do, and work was infinitely more interesting than the endless posturing that passed for conversation in the station's common areas. While the Cracknery flexed at each other and the Thorak compared grip strengths, Zara kept the life support systems running, the artificial gravity stable, and the fusion reactors humming along at optimal efficiency. Not that anyone particularly cared about these minor details. After all, any species could push buttons and read diagnostic displays. The real measure of worth was how much weight you could lift, how hard you could punch, and whether you could intimidate your way through a conversation. By these standards, humans rank somewhere between the Flickson Flower Rangers and the Glimmering Collective's pet translucent jellyfish. Thorak Ironscale, chief of station security, found the humans particularly amusing. Standing 7.5 feet tall with scales that could deflect small arms fire and muscles that rippled like tectonic shifts, he represented everything the Cracknery aspired to be. His daily routine included a morning workout that involved lifting components from decommissioned starships, followed by an afternoon of what he called maintenance rounds, but everyone else recognized as an excuse to demonstrate his physical superiority to anyone within earshot. He had made something of a hobby out of commenting on human limitations. Not maliciously, of course. He was far too civilized for outright cruelty. But there was something delightfully entertaining about watching them struggle with tasks that any respectable species would consider trivial. It was educational, really, a living reminder of how fortunate the rest of the galaxy was to have evolved proper strength and musculature. The morning shift change was proceeding with its usual symphony of complaints when the emergency klaxons decided to join the chorus. The sound echoed through the station's corridors with a particular urgency that meant something expensive was about to break in an expensive way. Zara was 3 levels deep in the maintenance sector, elbow deep in a recalibration unit, when her communicator crackled to life with the kind of panic usually reserved for imminent reactor meltdowns or surprise tax audits. Emergency in Lower Engineering Bay 7, the station's AI announced in its perpetually calm voice, as if discussing the weather rather than potential catastrophe. Critical component failure in primary reactor feed assembly. Immediate maintenance required. The response was predictably underwhelming. Lower Engineering Bay 7 was located in one of the station's oldest sections, where the corridors were narrow, the ceilings low, and the access panels had been designed by someone with a peculiar sense of humor and no understanding of ergonomics. Most species considered it a claustrophobic nightmare. The humans called it cozy. Within minutes, the usual parade of heavy-lifters had arrived to assess the situation. The Cracknery engineering team took one look at the access shaft and declared it physically incompatible with proper body dimensions. The Thorak tried to squeeze their four-armed bulk through the opening and managed to get stuck halfway, requiring a minor rescue operation and several tubes of industrial lubricant. The Threnody crystal beings simply vibrated at frequencies that suggested deep disappointment, while the molten core representatives started calculating the overtime pay for working in confined spaces. Thorak arrived during the midst of this engineering comedy, his scales gleaming under the emergency lighting, and his expression radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of brute force. "What seems to be the difficulty?" he inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would involve someone's inadequate physical capabilities. The chief engineer, a Cracknery named Grex whose scales bore the scars of several decades of mechanical disasters, gestured helplessly at the access shaft. "The primary feed coupling has fractured. Complete replacement required. But the access corridor is too narrow for any of our personnel to maneuver the component into position." Thorak examined the shaft with the critical eye of someone accustomed to finding fault with other people's problems. The corridor was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through, with several right-angle turns that would make maneuvering large objects an exercise in creative geometry. "Simple solution," he declared. "Widen the access corridor. A few strategic applications of plasma cutters should provide adequate space for proper workers to complete the repair." Grex's expression suggested this was roughly equivalent to performing brain surgery with a sledgehammer. The structural supports run through that entire section. Any modifications would require shutting down the reactor for 3 days minimum, plus extensive safety reviews, environmental impact assessments, and probably a formal inquiry into why we're cutting holes in the station's backbone. The crowd of various species that had gathered to observe the crisis murmured among themselves. 3 days without the primary reactor would mean switching to backup power, which would mean reduced environmental controls, which would mean every species would be uncomfortable in their own particular way. The molten core beings would complain about the temperature drop, the ice runners would protest the heat buildup, and the atmospheric processes would need constant adjustment to keep everyone from suffocating in their own preferred breathing mixtures. It was during this symphony of interspecies complaints that Zara appeared at the edge of the crowd, toolkit in hand and expression as unremarkable as always. She had been listening to the technical discussion with the kind of attention that suggested she actually understood what was being discussed, which immediately marked her as either highly competent or completely delusional. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the particular politeness that maintenance personnel used when they were about to suggest something that management wouldn't like. "I might be able to help." The conversation died with the suddenness of a comedy routine interrupted by a tax audit. Various species turned to examine this unexpected volunteer, their expressions ranging from puzzled to amused to openly skeptical. Thorak's laugh started as a low rumble and built to the kind of hearty guffaw that suggested he found the situation genuinely delightful. "Oh, this is rich. The little human thinks she can solve a problem that has stumped the finest engineers from 12 different species." His amusement was infectious. Several other Cracknery joined in with chuckles of their own, while the Thorak made the clicking sounds that passed for laughter in their culture. Even some of the more reserved species seemed to find the situation entertaining. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," Grex said with the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to small children. "But the replacement coupling weighs approximately 400 pounds and needs to be maneuvered through a series of right-angle turns in a space barely wide enough for a single person. It's simply not physically possible." Zara nodded thoughtfully, as if she was seriously considering the technical challenge rather than recognizing the obvious limitations of her species. 400 pounds, you said? And the clearance dimensions." Thorak's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching pity. "My dear little human, I could probably lift that component with one hand. But even I couldn't fit through that access corridor, and I suspect I'm considerably stronger than you are." The understatement of the millennium, delivered with a kind of gentle condescension that made it clear he was being charitable rather than cruel. Several other species nodded in agreement. It was simple physics, after all. Humans were weak, everyone knew it, and there was no shame in acknowledging obvious limitations. Perhaps we could discuss alternative solutions, Zara suggested, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing crowd of amused observers. I'd like to examine the component and the access route before we commit to structural modifications. The request was reasonable enough, and Grex was the kind of engineer who believed in thorough analysis before expensive decisions. He led the growing parade to the storage bay where the replacement coupling waited, a cylindrical mass of metal and ceramic that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never heard of the concept of portable. Zara walked around the component slowly, examining it from various angles, while the crowd watched with a kind of fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. She asked a few technical questions about mounting points and connection interfaces, nodding at the answers with the same unremarkable competence she brought to all her work. "Well," Thorak inquired after she had completed her inspection, "have you reached the same conclusion as everyone else, or do you have some miraculous human solution to propose?" There was still amusement in his voice, but it was tinged with something that might have been impatience. The emergency was real, after all. And while he enjoyed demonstrating superior crackery intelligence, there were practical matters to consider. "I think I can manage it," Zara said simply. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when someone has said something so obviously ridiculous that no one is quite sure how to respond. It was the conversational equivalent of claiming you could juggle neutron stars or teach quantum physics to houseplants. Thorak's laugh this time was shorter and sharper. "Oh, you think you can manage it? Just like that? 400 pounds of precision machinery through a corridor that proper species can't even fit through, and you think you can just manage it?" "The weight isn't really the issue," Zara replied with the same professional calm she used for routine maintenance reports. "It's more about leverage and spatial awareness. I've done similar installations before." This statement caused another ripple of amusement through the crowd. The idea that humans had experience with similar installations was entertaining enough, but the suggestion that weight wasn't an issue was genuinely hilarious. "Weight isn't an issue," Thorak repeated, his voice rising slightly. 400 pounds isn't an issue for a species that struggles to lift their own body weight in most gravitational fields. He turned to address the crowd, spreading his massive arms in a gesture that encompassed the absurdity of the situation. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of various classification systems, we are witnessing something truly special here. A human who has apparently transcended the basic limitations of physics through sheer force of optimism." The laughter was more general now, spreading through the various species with the kind of momentum that builds when everyone realizes they are part of a shared joke. Even the usually reserved crystalline beings were vibrating at frequencies that suggested amusement. Zara waited for the laughter to die down before responding. "I understand your skepticism, but I'd like to point out that we might be working from different baseline assumptions." "Different baseline assumptions," Thorak repeated, his voice dripping with mock seriousness. "Please, enlighten us. What crucial factor have the finest engineers from 12 species somehow overlooked?" "Well, for starters, what's the station's artificial gravity set to?" The question was so unexpected that Grex actually checked his readings before responding. "Standard galactic norm. 1.27 universal units. Why?" "And Earth gravity?" "I believe it's roughly 3.8 universal units," Grex replied, clearly wondering where this was leading. "But I failed to see the relevance." Zara nodded as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "So from my perspective, everything on this station weighs about a third of what I'm used to dealing with. That 400-pound component? On Earth, it would weigh over 1,200 pounds. The crowd's amusement began to ebb as the implications of this statement sank in. It was one of those obvious facts that everyone knew intellectually, but rarely considered practically. Earth was a high-gravity world. Everyone knew that. Humans were adapted to high gravity. Also common knowledge. But the practical applications of this simple reality had somehow never quite connected. Thorak's expression shifted from amusement to something more calculating. "Even assuming that's accurate, the physical constraints remain. You still can't fit a 400-pound object through a space barely wide enough for your body. That's true, Zara agreed. But I don't have to carry it. I just have to move it. There's a difference. She began removing items from her toolkit, laying them out with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this routine countless times before. Magnetic clamps, flexible support cables, portable winches, and several devices that most of the observers didn't recognize. Standard human maintenance equipment, she explained to the puzzled crowd. Designed for working in high-gravity environments where manual lifting isn't always practical. Thorak watched this preparation with growing unease. What had started as an amusing demonstration of human delusion was beginning to look suspiciously like actual competence. Even with tools, the logistics are impossible. The corridor turns. The component needs precise positioning. You can't possibly maneuver something that size through those constraints. You're right about the precision requirements, Zara acknowledged. But you're assuming I need to maneuver the entire mass at once. What if I don't? Before anyone could ask what she meant, she had activated one of her devices and attached it to the component. The coupling separated into 3 sections with a series of soft clicks, revealing an internal structure that was considerably more complex than the external appearance suggested. Modular design, she explained to the stunned crowd. Each section weighs roughly 130 pounds and can be installed separately. The final connections are made after all 3 pieces are in position. The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the previous pauses. This wasn't the silence of people trying to process something ridiculous. This was the silence of people realizing they had been operating under assumptions that were apparently incorrect. Greg stepped forward to examine the separated components. We didn't realize it could be disassembled for transport. The documentation didn't mention. Human documentation tends to assume certain baseline capabilities, Zara said diplomatically. We're used to working in environments where lifting 400 pounds at once isn't really an option. Thorak's expression had shifted again, this time to something that might have been irritation. The amusing demonstration of human incompetence was turning into something else entirely, and he didn't particularly like the implications. Fine, he said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. So you can take the component apart. That still doesn't mean you can actually install it. Physical strength isn't the only requirement. You need precision, technical knowledge, experience with critical systems. I've been maintaining critical systems on this station for 6 years, Zara replied mildly. I helped install the original coupling. This statement hit the crowd like a small but perfectly aimed explosive device. The idea that humans had been involved in the station's original construction was, well, it hadn't occurred to anyone to check. Maintenance personnel were largely invisible, after all, and everyone assumed that critical installations were handled by properly qualified species. Thorak's scales darkened to a deeper shade of green, which in Cracknery body language indicated rising aggression. Even assuming you have the technical knowledge, the physical demands remain. Working in a confined space, handling heavy components, maintaining precision under pressure, these are not tasks for. He paused, apparently realizing that finishing the sentence would involve saying something that might be considered diplomatically unfortunate. Not tasks for humans. Zara suggested helpfully. Not tasks for species with certain physical limitations, Thorak corrected, though his tone made it clear that diplomacy was requiring considerable effort. Zara nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. These aren't tasks for species with physical limitations. Fortunately, that's not really applicable here. She began loading the separated components onto a specialized transport cart, her movements displaying the kind of casual efficiency that comes from years of practice. The cart itself was clearly human-designed, with features that prioritized maneuverability over raw lifting capacity. If you'd like to observe the installation, she continued, you're welcome to monitor from the engineering station. Though I should mention that the access corridor has limited space for spectators. The crowd began to disperse, though not entirely. Curiosity was a powerful force, and the situation had evolved beyond simple entertainment into something genuinely unpredictable. Grex remained to provide technical oversight, while Thorak lingered with the obvious intention of being present when the humans' limitations inevitably manifested themselves. The access corridor was exactly as advertised, narrow, awkward, and designed by someone who had apparently never considered that maintenance personnel might need to actually use it. Zara disappeared into the opening with her equipment, leaving the observers to monitor her progress through the engineering displays. What followed was a masterclass in applied physics that most of the galaxy had apparently never considered. Using magnetic clamps and flexible cables, Zara had essentially created a three-dimensional pulley system within the corridor itself. Each component was guided through the turns using leverage points and mechanical advantage rather than brute force. The precision was remarkable. Every movement was calculated, every position optimized for the next stage of the process. It was engineering in its purest form, the application of intelligence and proper tools to overcome apparent limitations. Thorak watched the progress displays with growing discomfort. What he had expected to be a demonstration of human inadequacy was instead revealing something considerably more unsettling: the possibility that his assumptions about human capabilities were fundamentally flawed. "Impossible," he muttered, though he was no longer addressing anyone in particular. The strength requirements alone. Grex, who had been monitoring the technical readings, looked up from his displays. "Actually, the force measurements are quite reasonable. She's using mechanical advantage to reduce the actual lifting requirements to well within human parameters. It's actually rather clever." "Clever," Thorak repeated, his voice flat. "Yes, I suppose it is clever. But cleverness doesn't replace proper strength. When real physical demands arise." He was interrupted by Zara's voice over the communication system. "Vice component in position. Beginning mounting sequence." The technical displays showed the coupling's first section sliding into place with a kind of precision that normally required teams of specialists and extensive preparation. The mounting bolts aligned perfectly, the connection interfaces seated properly, and all diagnostic readings showed optimal parameters. "How is this possible?" Thorak demanded, though he seemed to be asking the universe rather than any specific person. "Well," Grex said thoughtfully, "humans do come from a high-gravity world. And they do have experience with complex engineering in challenging environments. We might have underestimated certain aspects of their capabilities." The understatement was so massive that it achieved a kind of accidental humor. For decades, the galactic community had operated under the assumption that humans were the weaklings of space, useful for delicate work, but incapable of handling serious physical challenges. This assumption was now being systematically dismantled by a maintenance engineer with a toolkit and an apparently unlimited supply of quiet competence. "Second component in position," Zara reported. "Connections nominal. Beginning final assembly sequence." Thorak's expression had progressed through several stages of disbelief and was now approaching something that might have been actual anger. The amusing demonstration he had anticipated was turning into a humiliation, and Cracknery did not handle humiliation with grace. "This is ridiculous," he announced to the engineering bay in general. "One human with some clever tools does not invalidate the basic physical realities of species comparison. Strength matters. Power matters. When situations require real physical capability, not clever engineering tricks." He was building toward what sounded like a more comprehensive dismissal of human capabilities when Zara emerged from the access corridor. She was slightly dusty from working in the confined space, but otherwise appeared as unremarkable as ever. "Installation complete," she reported to Grex. "All connections secured, diagnostic readings nominal. The reactor can be brought back to full capacity whenever you're ready." Grex checked his displays, ran several diagnostic sequences, and consulted with the reactor control team before nodding his approval. "Outstanding work. Precise, efficient, and well within safety parameters. We appreciate your assistance." The crowd that had gathered to watch the human fail was now dispersing with a distinctly subdued atmosphere. What they had witnessed wasn't easily categorized within their existing understanding of galactic hierarchies, and most species preferred to avoid cognitive dissonance when possible. Thorak, however, was not ready to let the matter rest. As Zara began packing up her equipment, he stepped forward with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he was preparing to make a point. "Well," he said, his voice carrying across the engineering bay, "that was certainly educational. though I think it's important to maintain perspective here. Zara looked up from her toolkit with the polite attention of someone who was probably going to regret asking what he meant. This was a technical challenge, Thorak continued, warming to his theme. Precision work, problem solving, the kind of delicate manipulation that humans seem reasonably suited for. But let's not pretend this demonstrates any kind of actual physical capability. He gestured broadly, encompassing not just Zara but the concept of humanity in general. When situations require real strength, genuine physical power, proper species superiority. He paused, apparently searching for the right words. Well, tools and cleverness only go so far. The engineering bay had gone quiet again, though this time the silence felt different. There was a tension in the air that suggested everyone present realized they were witnessing something that was either going to be very entertaining or very awkward. Zara finished packing her toolkit and straightened up, giving Thorak her full attention. "You're absolutely right," she said calmly. "Tools and cleverness do have their limitations." Thorak's expression brightened, apparently interpreting this as vindication of his position. "Exactly. I knew you understood the fundamental realities. Physical strength, raw power, the natural advantages that proper evolution provides. These things matter when the situation demands real capability." "They certainly do," Zara agreed. "Though I think there might be another fundamental reality we should consider." "And what would that be?" Zara began removing her standard-issue maintenance coveralls, revealing what appeared to be a second layer of clothing underneath. Except it wasn't clothing at all. It was some kind of fitted framework that covered her torso and limbs, with small mechanical components at various joints and connection points. "Gravity compensation suit," she explained, noting the puzzled expressions around her. "Standard issue for humans working in low-gravity environments. Adds about 60 pounds of mass and restricts joint movement to simulate Earth normal conditions." She began disconnecting the framework's various components with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times. "The idea is to maintain proper muscle tone and bone density when working in artificial gravity that's only a third of what we're adapted to." The components came away piece by piece, revealing a human who was still recognizably human but somehow different. Without the restrictive framework, her movements had a fluid quality that hadn't been apparent before. Her posture was straighter, her stance more balanced. "You see," she continued conversationally while folding up the framework, "you're absolutely right about the importance of physical capability. But you might want to reconsider your assumptions about human physical capability." Thorak was staring at her with an expression that suggested he was beginning to suspect this conversation wasn't going to end the way he had anticipated. What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that for the past 6 years, I've been working on this station while wearing the equivalent of 60 pounds of weights and joint restrictors, in a gravitational field that's about a third of what my body was designed for." She smiled, though there wasn't much humor in it. "And you've been assuming that represented my normal physical capabilities." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when everyone present realizes they've been operating under assumptions that were not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. Thorak's scales had shifted to a darker green, and his stance had become more aggressive. Whether this was conscious or instinctive was unclear, but the result was the same: 7.5 feet of heavily muscled predator preparing for confrontation. "Even assuming your claims are accurate," he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled hostility that preceded violence, "the fundamental hierarchy remains unchanged. Crackery physiology represents the pinnacle of evolutionary development. Raw strength, superior reflexes, natural weapons." He extended his claws slightly, a gesture that was probably meant to be intimidating. "These advantages don't disappear because humans are marginally less weak than we assumed." "Marginally less weak," Zara repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to put it." She was standing differently now, her posture relaxed but somehow more centered. Without the bulk of the compensation suit, she appeared smaller but also more compact, like energy that had been compressed into a more efficient form. "Perhaps we should test that assumption," Thorak suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion at all. A practical demonstration of the natural order. Nothing harmful, of course, just educational. The crowd that had been dispersing suddenly found reasons to linger. Violence wasn't uncommon on Nexus Station. With 47 species in close proximity, conflicts were inevitable, but it was usually regulated, controlled, conducted in designated areas with proper safety measures. What was developing in the engineering bay had the feel of something more spontaneous and potentially more interesting. Zara considered the suggestion with the same calm attention she brought to technical problems. You want a practical demonstration of physical capabilities. I think it would be illuminating, Thorak replied, his smile revealing teeth that had been designed for rending rather than chewing. All right, Zara said simply. But let's make sure we're both clear on the parameters. You want to test relative strength and physical capability between our species, correct? Exactly. And you're confident that cracnery physiology represents superior evolutionary development? Absolutely. Then I suppose we should find out. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the observers weren't entirely sure they had seen it correctly. Thorak, clearly intending to demonstrate his superiority through a display of overwhelming physical advantage, stepped forward and reached out to grab Zara's shoulder. His hand never made contact. Instead, Zara moved with a speed and fluidity that seemed to belong to an entirely different species. She stepped inside his reach, her hand finding his wrist, and suddenly Thorak was airborne. Not lifted, launched. He flew backward through the engineering bay with the kind of trajectory that suggested significant force had been applied, passed through the open doorway, and continued down the corridor beyond with a series of impacts that echoed through the station's hull. The silence that followed was profound and lasted exactly long enough for everyone present to process what they had witnessed. Then the emergency klaxons began sounding again, this time with a particular tone that meant medical emergency in progress. Zara picked up her toolkit and the folded compensation suit, nodding politely to Grex. If there are any issues with the coupling installation, just let me know. I'll be in maintenance section C, catching up on routine work. She walked toward the exit, pausing at the doorway to look back at the crowd of stunned aliens. Oh, and for future reference, Earth gravity is actually 4.2 universal units, not 3.8. I was being diplomatic. The medical team found Thorak 3 corridor sections away, conscious but significantly less confident about cracnery evolutionary superiority than he had been 10 minutes earlier. The diagnostic readings suggested multiple impacts with bulkhead surfaces, though no permanent damage. His pride, however, might require more extensive rehabilitation. Within hours, the story had spread throughout the station with the kind of momentum that comes from an event too interesting to keep secret. The details grew with each telling, but the essential facts remained consistent. The chief of security had challenged a human maintenance engineer to a demonstration of physical capability, and the human had sent him flying. The administrative response was swift and comprehensive. New guidelines were issued regarding assumptions about species capabilities. The human equipment requisitions that had been repeatedly denied for exceeding reasonable specifications was suddenly approved. Several other species began quietly reviewing their own assumptions about the humans in their employ. Zara returned to her routine maintenance schedule as if nothing particularly noteworthy had occurred. She reinstalled her compensation suit, resumed her unremarkable appearance, and went back to keeping the station's critical systems operational. The only visible change was that other species tended to give her more space in the corridors, though whether this was from respect or caution remained unclear. The galactic hierarchy didn't collapse overnight. 4 to 7 species don't abandon their fundamental assumptions about reality based on a single incident, no matter how dramatic. But small changes began appearing throughout Nexus Station. Humans were consulted more frequently on engineering problems. Their suggestions were taken more seriously. Their requests for equipment and resources were processed with less bureaucratic resistance. And in the security offices, new protocols were established regarding the handling of incidents involving human personnel. These protocols were notably more cautious than the previous versions, though officially they were described as updates to reflect evolving best practices in interspecies relations. Thorak himself became something of an advocate for what he carefully termed species capability reassessment. His experience had been educational in ways he was still processing, and he discovered that humility was a surprisingly useful addition to his professional toolkit. He never again made assumptions about physical limitations based solely on appearance, and his security training programs began including sections on the dangers of underestimating potential adversaries. The universe, it turned out, was full of assumptions that seemed perfectly reasonable until someone came along to demonstrate their fundamental flaws. The Nexus Station had been built on the assumption that physical strength could be easily categorized and ranked, that appearance was a reliable indicator of capability, and that the natural order of things was both obvious and unchangeable. But sometimes, the universe enjoyed reminding everyone that assumptions were just theories waiting to be tested. And sometimes, those tests came in the form of a maintenance engineer with a toolkit, a professional demeanor, and the kind of quiet competence that could send a 7.5-foot warrior flying through a doorway. The station continued to float in the void, its 47 interconnected sections representing 47 different approaches to civilization. The commerce continued, the negotiations proceeded, and the complex dance of interspecies diplomacy carried on much as it always had. But now everyone was a little more careful about their assumptions. And in the maintenance sections, the humans worked with perhaps a bit more confidence, knowing that their capabilities were no longer quite so thoroughly underestimated. After all, there's nothing quite like practical demonstration to clarify misunderstandings about the natural order of things.